The moment, if I don't know how many people here are regular readers of Adam Phillips, I'm assuming a lot of you are. So if you are, then the moment you hear that Adam Phillips has written a book called Attention Seeking, immediately your mind is awakened to all the possibilities that you hadn't noticed just in the title alone. Immediately you begin to think, why have I never paid attention to that term? Why has that term always been judged by me harshly? Why is that term not obviously a good thing? And so on. So just the moment you even read a title by Adam Phillips, a kind of electricity sort of happens. However, as it turns out, that doesn't mean you can predict what's in the book. The book remains completely unpredictable. And I think one of the reasons this book is unpredictable is, in some ways, this is the conversation we're all having right now. We're all suffering from a kind of ADHD. We're all addicted to our mobile phones. We can't focus. What's gone wrong with us? And because for reasons that I think we'll go into, this idea of attention has always been it seems quite loud. Can you hear me? Has always been bound up with a lot of moralization and notions about morality. This book is not going to sort of join us worrying about our attention deficit disorder and so on. It's not going to blame us for being focused on the wrong things or in the wrong ways. When I read this book, very quickly a line appeared in the book that seemed to me like the whole weight of my existence was lifted off my shoulders. And that line was, attention seeking is one of the best things we do. Attention seeking is one of the best things we do. No one had ever mentioned that to me. And my desire for attention has always been a profound source of shame. So attention seeking is one of the best things we do, even if we have the worst ways of doing it. But all of this, of course, begs the question, what is this thing that we seek that's called attention? What is attention? Should we start there?
Do I have to tell you now?
Oh, no, maybe not.
No, I could.
Maybe not.
I could.
Oh, you could. Go on.
The book, in a way, is about that question, which is, when we are attention-seeking, what is it we want attending to, and what kind of attention do we think we want? The book came out of something that I imagine everybody here has experienced, which is people will say very disparagingly, often of children, but often of people, he is very attention-seeking. And obviously we're all supposed to nod and say, oh God, how awful. And it seems to me quite clear there's nothing else that we can do but seek attention. And if you think of it, I don't want to go on length of this, but if you think of it in terms of development and child development, of course, there's something very, very powerful about babies and young children. It's their capacity to actually recruit attention, that they're magnetic in some way, if you like them. And so this is a very powerful fundamental thing, but it's as though at a certain point in development, attention-seeking becomes something that is obviously morally appalling. Something we should learn not to do, and yet we need attention, so we're in a bind. So we have to find acceptable ways of getting the attention we want or need. The other bit, just briefly, is that I think one of the things that interests me about attention-seeking is the fact that it may be like a probe or an experiment in living, as in obvious attention-seeking behavior. It's not obvious what it is, what the attention is that's being wanted. And I think in a way it's a fundamental form of sociability, this. It's like a joke, which is you do your attention-seeking behavior and you're trying to find out how other people will respond to it as a way of finding out what it is. Because you don't know entirely what it is you want, but you know you want something. So the book's, I think one of the ideas in the book is, of course the book is the sentences in the book, but one of the ideas in the book is that attention-seeking is always an experiment in living. And
I think that's what this book is short and Adam writes beautifully and grippingly, as you know, if you've read him. He's not writing as if for the Academy. He's writing for the heart and soul, and the body, of course. However, it's short. But I had a couple of people over to dinner, and I read the first line aloud, and that was it for the night. We couldn't move on from there. We had too many. It had provoked too much in us. So it's short, but the problem of attention is a constant when you're reading it, not because you're bored, but because it's thought-provoking, it's dream-provoking, and a kind of anxiety attends to that, because the book seems to be reading you. You're thinking about attention, and the book is attending to the way in which you're attending to it. And it becomes sort of a strange thing where am I reading it, or is it me reading me? Am I thinking about it, or am I not thinking about it? And when I'm not thinking about it, is that when I'm thinking about it? And so on. And I think the fact that this object has no name, that it's what we're seeking, but we don't know what it is the experience of the book. You refuse to define attention in the book, and that makes the book very experiential. Can you talk about this idea that the idea of this book is that there are no big ideas?
Yeah. I think there's a sentence in the book which is something like, it's the difference between knowing what we're doing and following our eyes, EYES. And I think in a way, it's an obvious thing, which is, the question is, what and who are we looking at? Who do we want to listen to? What do we listen to? In other words, there's a continual, ongoing, selective attention going on in everybody all the time. And so it seemed to me that there's something very enigmatic about this fact, because obviously we don't notice it. Why would we particularly notice it? Except when it troubles us. So if, for example, I have a phobia or an addiction, my attention is very, very over-organized, extremely organized. And I think one of the things that psychoanalysis, but not only psychoanalysis, but also psychoanalysis frees one to do, is to be unseduced by the need to organize one's experience into one big idea. So that it appears in psychoanalysis that there are a few big ideas called sex or reparation or depression or whatever. There's a whole range of these things. But it seems to me they're all, in a way, attempts, as Freud was involved in, to contain whatever it is that's opened up by psychoanalysis. Because I think what's opened up by psychoanalysis, understandably, generates a lot of anxiety and a lot of excitement. So then we've got to have an idea about what it is, say, psychoanalysts are doing, or what you go to a psychoanalyst for. So our attention has to be organized in the practice of doing it. But in going to see a psychoanalyst, you've organized your attention to go there, and then you're going to be, in the kind of analysis that I value, invited to be inattentive, to speak without attending to your words, without, as it were, trying to say the right thing or indeed the wrong thing. You will just speak insofar as you're able. And what that means is, in the process of doing that, it opens up how much more you've been attending to than you are in fact conscious of. And in Freud's idea of dream work, which I think is a really wonderful idea, it's simply, and I imagine most people in this room know this, but basically the idea is we're now in the dream day, the day before tonight's dream. We've had all these experiences, seen these things, smelt these things, whatever. But obviously no one can predict what they're going to dream tonight. And what we do in fact dream, if we remember it, may well have a detail that we were from the day that we were not aware of ourselves noticing. In other words, the dream maker in ourselves is perceptive in a way that we aren't, or aren't aware of being. So the other thing I suppose that's around in this is that we are much more attentive than either we can be aware of or want to know about. So there's a kind of a multiple perception going on that is focused and contained. And when there's too much anxiety, it's over-contained. But I think there's always a temptation. This is where the big idea comes in, because the big idea is like a sexual perversion. It's something we can do to organize something that feels too prodigal. So if I can organize my sexual desire into a sexual perversion, one thing that is a precondition for my excitement, then it's as though I've solved the problem of the variety of my own desire. I know what sex is for me. Whereas, of course, no one really knows what sex is for them, but it generates the kind of anxiety that would make one want to narrow it to a big idea. And I think Freud has the big idea actually is that we don't necessarily need big ideas. That's the kind of experiment he's inviting us to do.
Which is, I think, why when one's reading the book, one finds one's defenses are very are quite. There's no big idea,
Yeah.
and so there's nothing. So that any notion of having mastery over in the position of reader is very quickly dissipated, and it's an extraordinary experience. But there were a couple of things that you brought
Could
up.
I just interrupt you for 1 second? Yeah. When you said that, I thought of something that happened to me, which I think is linked to this, which is I was standing in the shallow end of a swimming pool in America, and a 4 or 5-year-old little girl swam up to me, beaming. She stopped in front of me and she said, "You're odd." And I said to her, "What's odd about me?" And she said, "You're not my dad." And she burst out laughing and swam over to her dad. Now, in child development, there is something called 8-month anxiety or stranger anxiety. But then somebody had a more interesting idea, which is that at 8 months, it's not that the child perceives a stranger, they perceive somebody as not mother, which is a very, very interesting and a very, very different idea. So you could imagine adult life is a process of going on meeting different versions of not mother and not father, and so and not sister and not brother, and so on and so forth. And so around this is the idea of attention. You, in a sense, start attending to your mother, parents, whatever. The question then is what kind of attention you can give, or what kind of attention you find yourself giving to not mother, or not father, or whatever. And so your attention begins, although you don't think of it like this, obviously, very, very organized. You have objects to attend to. And then something happens. And it's not that you stop attending them, but you attend to other things as well. And then attention gets very complicated, I think.
And one thing I'm of course thinking about the way in which I'm ferocious over my own children's distractions and the kind of rage. One thing that you mentioned there, which you mentioned in the book, which is an extraordinary formula, really, which is the idea that things become interesting. Things only really become interesting to us when we become interested in our interest. And in your description of that process, we only become interested in our interests when our interests have started to disturb us, which I think you linked to that becoming attentive to outside the family. Could you suggest a little more of
Yes. I mean,
the interesting is?
Well, I suppose you only have to attend to your interest when it begins to persecute you. If I begin to become very, very interested in pigeons, I am pigeon phobic, then my attention is very, very organized. I have to be hyper alert to that. And then, it seems to me, you can't help but be interested in your interest. And one of the things about all symptoms is they, of course, organize your attention and they make you think about yourself. If you're anxious or depressed or whatever it is, you are thinking almost only about yourself. So in this story, the aim of psychoanalysis is to free you to lose interest in yourself. In other words, you can lose interest in yourself such that the external world and other people and so on become as interesting as they in fact are. A symptom is something that closes that down and everything returns back to what looks like base. It isn't actually, but it looks like it is. So I think we become interested in our interest, either because it interests us and it's pleasurable to be interested in it, or because it becomes a problem. It becomes something we can't help but think about.
And the idea of self-interest being a kind of inability to attend, a sort of kind of dreadful narrowing of attention, which this book doesn't have a big idea, but I have to say it does have a structure. And I think the structure is telling, because as I see it, the structure begins by seeking, attention, then moves towards receiving attention, which you call shame and attention, what it is to be on the end, to be seeking this thing and then getting it, and then how we feel about that. And the word for that is shame, actually. And then we move in the final part to losing attention, as though that's the kind of necessary process. Was it a thought through structure?
No, that sounds right to me, but it certainly wasn't. But that certainly makes sense. And what's interesting to me about that is that it was at the very last minute that I changed the order, that I thought that shame and attention should be the second chapter, and that sort of explains it in a way. But I think that the middle bit, so to speak, which is about shame and attention, is about, I suppose, two things. One is how shame constrains and organizes our attention, and what kind of attention we're giving ourselves when we are mortified.
The parts on, I should say that this book also has, one thing you've already indicated is that psychoanalysis pays attention to our inattention, and that's its method. And you have this beautiful idea that before that psychoanalysis appeared, it was as though symptoms were calling for a new type of doctor, calling out, saying, nobody is paying attention to me. So that a subject's inattentions in the form of their symptoms were directed towards a doctor that was yet to be invented. And for you, this is inattention and attention is endlessly generative.
Yeah.
It's a form of wanting that has to invent its own.
Yeah.
So that psychoanalysis comes along to pay this attention to our inattention. And then, as you said, the dream work is the sort of record of our unnoticed noticings. But then what's fascinating about that, you say, is, and yet the result is something we don't know how to pay attention to. Yeah. We don't know how to pay attention to dreams.
Well, that seems to me amazing. Yeah. I mean, that when we're dreaming, we can't help but pay attention. I mean, on the whole, one may be distracted in the drama of one's dream, but one's not distracted from one's dream. And that something amazing is produced by us, but obviously not, in a sense, not by us. And then when we wake up, and if we remember it, it can feel fascinating and extraordinary and completely baffling. So it's as though we haven't found the attention, or we don't know what the attention is that we might give it that would be worth giving it. Now, very often, other people's dreams, depending on whether we love and desire them or they're in psychoanalysis, other people's dreams can be very boring. And that itself seems to me to be very interesting, because they are clearly, in a sense, a profound bulletin from the self to the self, but that's another place where we occlude our attention. Because why aren't we fascinated by other people's dreams? Why, when somebody tells us a dream, aren't we wired as though they were telling us a great joke? Well, we often switch off. And so this seems to me very extraordinary, that we've made something at night, and after all, no one has to be taught how to dream. Most of us, almost everybody does it. And we make something up we couldn't possibly have calculated, and we look at it, but not with our eyes. We wake up to it, and we're baffled. And then, modernly, there's the interpretation of dreams, which says, well, you could do this, or if you do that, then this happens, etc. But of course, historically, there have been lots of different ways of reading dreams. But lots of people have been, in different ways, curious about the function of the dream as its meaning, in some sense, while it not being clear where the meaning comes from. And what Freud does is he democratizes dreams. Everybody has them, and all you've got to do is free associate with the right person. You can't be, you are the expert on your own dream, but you may need help with your expertise.
There is this, you quote Freud as saying that he has a prehistory in the form of poets, right? That he's not the first to pay attention to inattention, and your own book goes Renaissance literature, 18th century literature, Jane Austen, James Baldwin, modernism. And you say at one point, I'm not here writing an intellectual history, I'm noticing some recurrent concerns and a persistent vocabulary that keeps reappearing. But you do also tell this rather tragic story about the fact that our acts of inattention, which are, in the sort of paradoxical universe here, the ways in which we're calling for attention, the things we aren't noticing we're doing are the very moments when we're attention-seeking, actually.
Yeah. And the very moments when we need other people.
When we need other people.
Yeah.
You say most people just don't notice those.
Yeah.
That actually our kind of our symptoms, our slips, these are mostly just disregarded.
Yeah.
So even though the classroom, where, I mean, you talk a lot about regimes of attention where we're forced to feel terribly bad about focusing on the wrong things, being distracted, daydreaming and so on. And yet the classroom, the figure of that authoritarian teacher in the classroom is someone who will notice our every inattention, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I wonder if somehow this sort of therapy is linked to a kind of institutional kind of way of being. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do, yeah. I mean, the context would have to determine the way in which things are understood or seen, and indeed what is seen. And I do think it's very interesting. I mean, it may be tragic, but it may not be, that so many things are missed. You know, the thing Henry James says, be someone upon whom nothing is lost. It's a version of that, and obviously no one can do that, really. But the question is how much we can bear to be attentive, how much we can bear to be in touch with reality. Because if we are sufficiently in touch with reality, there will be a huge amount of stimuli, of unnoticed acts. Now, the problem is that if somebody doesn't get our joke, we might have to devote our lives to finding the person who does. And that would be true of our slips, our gestures, or whatever it is that we don't know, but actually we want somebody else to recognize in some way or do something with. So I don't think it's that we want to be understood. I think it's we want what we do to be transformed into something else that keeps the thing moving in some way. So I don't think it's the quest for the great understander. I think it's a quest for the great transformer, probably. And obviously people are different about this, but it's more like that. And we're doing all sorts of many more things than we realize. And then we are totally dependent on other people to see what gets picked up. And you can see as a child growing up, you become habituated to the things they are likely to pick up and the things they don't want to pick up. And so you become, in a way, regimented. Inevitably, it's not vile, but you are regimented. So the question is, what happens then to the either unseen or unacknowledged or unrecognized parts of oneself? And you could think, well, it's a quest somewhere. One of the things you might be doing is either a defeatedness or the quest for whatever it was about ourselves that our parents couldn't recognize or misrecognize in certain ways. So we're all the time looking for the better audience. But it is a kind of performance art, this.
And I think that's why attention seeking is, it's very generative. It's very creative.
Absolutely, yeah.
And when you say it's inventing forms of sociality that might not yet exist, and ways of doing language. And
that's why the disapproval is such a killer, because it preempts the thing right from the beginning. And so the child really loses heart about exhibitionism. Making an exhibition of yourself. Why not? But
there is, a kind of counterpoint. A counterpoint to this is it Ernest Jones you quote as this? I hadn't heard the word. Aphanisis. I hadn't even heard the word before. Which is, I imagine you see people who come to you with this as an issue.
Yeah.
As this idea that people might lose all interest in everything and in life, not because they're inhibited, but because they really have lost their appetite for life. So attention seeking has ended for them.
Yes, exactly.
And that would be the tragedy. So do you have a theory or series of theories about what leads to that?
Well, I would imagine there are at least two things here. One is either desiring has met a very, very poor or humiliating response. Or maybe the same point, one can't back one's desire, or something has happened, so there's a retreat. It could be thought of as a lack of confidence or a traumatic withdrawal, as in there's something out desiring that is too disturbing to me. So my experience is I have no desire. There's nothing I'm interested in. Now today it would probably be called depression, which for some people may add something to the conversation, but for lots of people it may not. And really it would seem to me, the question would be, what's your lack of interest a self-cure for? What was the original conflict or problem that mobilized the lack of desire as the only way out or through? It would be like that.
the figure of the hysteric appears later in the book in Shame, and particularly linked to women in shame, actually. But where she's also suffering from desire, but she's also the figure of the ultimate attention seeker. How do we incorporate her dealings with desire into...
Well, one way of putting it, without glamorizing it, is that whoever these people are like failed artists. They haven't got the message through. There was a very interesting paper by Masood Khan called Grudge and the Hysteric, where Khan says, the question is, why are these hysterics so florid, so bizarre? And the answer is, they are people who have no confidence that they can find a place in other people's minds. So they have to be more vivid, more enigmatic, more dramatic to actually capture somebody's attention and make somebody think about them. So it's partly an attempt to be in someone else's mind such that one can be thought about, and then there can be an exchange. It could partly be a fact that it's a language that hasn't yet found its interpreter. There might be lots of things we do that are on the spectrum with what was once called hysteria, that are all at the moment messages that misfire, or enigmatic messages, or things we have no other way of communicating about but with our bodies, or through bizarre speech, or whatever it is. But it's as though they're looking for their listeners.
I think we're now in shame. I've been there all along. But I've got to watch it. I've read a lot about shame, but this section on shame has really, really been an extraordinary. It's as if everything else I read just matters not a jot now. But this section on shame is so powerful. Shame narrows our attention so that we're unable to focus on anything but ourselves. So we're losing attention to all the other things that might interest us. And that focus on the self becomes self-mortifying, a desire to disappear. And you quote sources where the desire, it all very familiar to me, I have to say, where the feeling of shame is that I'm completely transparent to others. They can see right through me and so on. And you say that this is, well, before I bring in the really exciting idea, I'll just bring in this link to the notion of trauma, where trauma is that which is unable to redescribe or transform itself. And shame is linked here to being in a situation where you just can't imagine anything else, ever being able to redescribe or turn this event and this experience into another possibility. Could you talk to that?
Well, it's as though shame exposes the truth about yourself. As though when you're ashamed, a really malign essentialism has taken hold. You fail to be the person you should be and really are. So there's a catastrophic self-betrayal going on here. But the power of it is that it's impossible to then think or talk about whether one really believes in the things one has supposedly violated. Because in that sense, shame is conservative. It gets you back to a position of knowing exactly who you should be. The person who doesn't do the shameful act. Now, if you give this a moment's thought, you can see that on the one hand, there's the mortified person. But which is worse, the mortified person or the person who's mortified them? In other words, the part of oneself that has made one feel ashamed is a monster, is a really cruel, humiliating figure. So is the shamer or the shamed worse, so to speak? And why is there this such a violent internal tyranny? Because in shameful experiences, one is supposedly dealing with what are consensually agreed to be the most unacceptable parts of oneself. So it's as though when we feel shame, in a way, we've returned to normality. We've remembered who we really are. So you could see a shame experience as sometimes that, but also sometimes the point at which it has been decided that the conversation must stop here. And if you give this a 2 seconds thought, you'll know that there were supposedly extremely shameful experiences in the past that have become, in inverted commas, normal. well, this is extraordinary. I mean, let's say 30 years ago and probably today, there are people who have felt deeply ashamed about being gay. And there are people now who don't. How's this happened? What's the process? But you can see retrospectively that the intention to shame is itself, well, obviously it's persecutory, but it's also an attempt to stop the conversation, to stop change, to over-contain something.
It's why, I mean, so this experience of shame, like, I can't begin to tell you how much I recognize this as my own attention seeking, which is quite compulsive, is always followed by weeks of unbearable shame about what the hell was I doing? Yeah. It's going to happen later, hopefully. So, but if you think about that,
yeah. There's not a comment at you personally, but if we have this conversation now, and then for the next 3 nights you're in a state of unbearable, etc., the question would be, why you need to do that to yourself. In other words, what's the project here? Well, you could think the project is to shut you up. In other words, the message is, look, don't do that again. Okay, if you do that, this is what's going to happen. What that stops is the thought about the enjoyment of what you've done and the possible future of what you've done. It could have some momentum. It could lead to the next thing you do. But actually, the project here is to make sure you don't ever change. As long as you're ashamed of yourself after this, you will never do anything again, if they win.
I guess that's you. So, but I think perhaps. So here we have a kind of a sort of your final thing is an appendix, which happened to be where you began this whole attention-seeking project, which is Stephen Greenblatt on distraction, and you quote him saying that the job of the critic really is to track the movements that provoke the most intense pleasure and the most intense anxiety. And I read your book with the most intense pleasure and the most intense anxiety. And I think the intense pleasure was feeling, amongst other things, attention-seeking is a good thing. Mm. And the intense anxiety was that self-interest is the most stupid thing we do. And that's the narrowing of attention. And I kept noticing that it seemed to be all about me. So the shame tonight would be that I said this and that I made it all about myself. So here's where I'm just going to read you, because the most extraordinary line. Our style. So this comes out of A.D. Miller's response to Jane Austen, saying that her writing is the product of a shameful relationship to marriage. Then we get James Baldwin, and his writing becomes a product of a shameful relationship to love, actually, and affection. Yeah. And then we get Freud, whose writing is a product of a shameful relationship to sexuality or sex. So we get sort of marriage, love, and sex are all kind of creating these shameful relationships. But the point is that they are managing to redescribe. And so you say our style is always a shameful relation to something. I mean, it's an amazing statement. Our style is always a shameful relation to something. Can you talk about that?
Yes, that if we're talking about writing style, but it could be personal styles in all sorts of ways, are, whatever else they are, attempts to transform the things we feel we need to conceal. Because obviously, if shame is the only game in town, then concealment is the only game in town, then performance is the only game in town, in which you're all the time flirting with what's going to be exposed and what you can manage to conceal. So one of the ways of thinking about style would be, it's an attempt to transform, expose and inhibit, or expose in acceptable ways, such that something can move. You can go on writing or go on performing. So the style would be the word for a process of transformation. And I think in terms of something you mentioned earlier, I think what is interesting here, at least to me, is that if a trauma is untransformed, one transformable experience, then every single thing that we believe or repeat is akin to a trauma, unless we've transformed it. So if, let's say, and this is the bit of the world I know, if you're a psychoanalyst, if you become a Kleinian or a Lacanian or a Freudian, then in a way you've been traumatized by these people because you've been unable to transform them enough into something of, as it were, your own. So that there's the wish to be traumatized, which is the wish to submit, which is to do with the fear of transformation. So any experience you can't transform, and shame would be like an emblem of this. It's worth wondering why you can't, or who's stopping you.
And style is such a sort of an amorphous term, because you could say that style is a synonym for personality, for character.
Yeah.
That when you meet a person's character, you're meeting their shameful relationship to something.
Yes, and what they've done with it.
And what they've done with it.
Yeah, yeah.
I have to say, there is a thing that's known out there as a sort of Phillipsian style. I don't know if you've heard of this, but you have a style, and I think it's very recognizable. I think it's very marked. And is it a shameful relation? I read this book and wondered if it's a shameful relationship to attention. Is it?
I would have thought it must be. Whatever else it is, it must be that. I mean, the thing about one's style is, for me, is that it's like your smell. You can't smell it. You need other people to tell you about it. I mean, I believe I've got a style, but I can't recognize it. And when people say it to me, I can believe them, but I don't know what it is, because I just write it. You know, it's not that I'm trying to imitate myself, so to speak. I'm just writing these sentences that occur to me. But nevertheless, I infer that unconsciously what is going on is the attempt to transform many experiences that I don't know about into something that is acceptable, interesting, engaging, pleasurable, and so on, with a wish to get a response that will enable me to go on transforming it. That's what I think is going on.
There is in this book. When you say shame is the thing that will not be redescribed, and then you redescribe it. In fact, can I find the? You say this amazing that shame is. I haven't got it here, but at some point you say shame is in some ways the attention seeking of the exhibitionist who feels ashamed is going out there. And because you point out that people like who are very easily ashamed are addicted to being shamed, do it again and again and again to themselves, even though it repeats and repeats and repeats, and they can't get past it. So as if they are going out with a kind of end of language moment. They've sort of met this sort of end. They know they want something, but they have nothing. There's no vocabulary, and nor does anybody else.
Or you don't know whether anybody else does.
Right.
In other words, this is where your omniscience ends, or where you want it to end, such that there's something else that you haven't thought of. Because I presume we do these things either to master them, hoping that it'll be revised, or because they're so pleasurable. You know, it may be as unconscious pleasure, but there's something, because the question is, why would anybody risk being shamed? You know, I mean, to be, say, a stand-up comic, or for us to sit here, whatever, there are lots of risks in these public performances, and people enjoy them, and people are drawn to them, and people want to watch other people doing them. And it seems to me that one of the things one might be watching is the spectacle of between concealment and performance, and what actually lands, what engages you in that.
So that's the idea that somehow in those moments of repeat humiliation and attention seeking, one is every time in a state of inventiveness and being generative. It's quite hard for me to get across. But I'm fascinated that the order came to you last, because we then move on to, I don't know how I'm doing for time, but we then move on to what you call vacancies of attention, which is a quote from Samuel Johnson's Rasselas, and you link, and this is we're now in the 18th century, and we're linking Samuel Johnson's History of Rasselas to Sterne's Tristram Shandy, and vacancies of attention. It does feel like we're talking about the internet now, because we're talking about the happy valley, and the kind. What is it when you have everything at your fingertips, basically? Whenever everything is, we would now say, a click away, there to satisfy you, and yet it creates more and more distraction. Can we talk about the role of inattention in this story?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that interests me is the way in which, when we're taught, say, to read books or look at pictures or whatever, we're obviously taught a kind of attention. It's quite interesting to also think, what kind of distraction does any artifact lead one to, or any person? We know what the official forms of attention and attentiveness are, but we could also wonder, and what are the distractions to which these objects or people lead us? In other words, all that does is it gives attention to the fact that the mind is vagrant as well as focused. And so there's always a lot more going on than one can be aware of, but one does get glimpses of it. And the question, in a way, you could think, well, what psychoanalysis does, it picks up on the glimpses. It encourages you and enables you to follow up and through with things that just fleetingly cross your mind, or minimal impressions, or whatever they are, but the things that you're tempted not necessarily actively to dismiss, but just not to bother with. And so I think, it's very interesting, Freud's idea that the best way to listen is not to concentrate. It's like the Marion Miller thing I quote, where she said to me once, "When I paint a tree in a field, I look at everything but the tree." And that's a very, very interesting idea, once you get over the sort of, naff zenness of it, because you can see, in a way, what she's getting at is that concentration actually limits attention. If you were to listen in a certain kind of attentive state as a psychoanalyst, you would, of course, find what you're looking for, because that's what attention is. It's the satisfaction of preference or assumption. So that you have to find a way of listening in a different way, so you yourself, and indeed the so-called patient, can be surprised. So the interesting, not the only interesting moments, but some of the interesting moments are when one is surprised, or the person one is seeing is surprised. As if to say, this hadn't occurred to me until, or I hadn't thought this.
And I think you are moving towards redescription, or maybe releasing yourself from a traumatized relationship to Freud in some way in this book. Yeah. But because Freud's free-floating attention, I mean, you're completely standing up for it, but you are troubling his description of that as to do always with sexuality, or to do with wanting. And then you move into this wide-angled attention at the end of Marion Milner, which is something else, actually. It's not to do with wanting.
No, it's not. And the question is, if it's not to do with wanting, what is it to do with? Or does it have to be to do with anything? But there are clearly ways of looking that are not about satisfying wants, or are not desire-driven in the familiar picture we have of desires. So what would it be like to be perceptive without being desiring? And that's something we can't imagine. But if the idea attracts your attention, it means you can imagine something.
But did you think she was able to do that?
I think she was, yeah. She was totally convincing. And I imagine we've all had moments of this. I don't think this is really science fiction. I just think it's very hard, given the way we've all been educated, to imagine.
Also the Stephen Greenblatt too, because you have these two sort of, I think, redescriptions actually at the end. One is, and also you set this up at the beginning, because you ask at the beginning, which I think is really the key question, but what would a life without a focus, or without even feeling you had to have a focus, look like, be like? So would you say that's the question?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And how does that fit with also a life of wanting? So it's not as though let's have another kind of life, but how compatible are these lives? And can we imagine what it would be like to live without purpose? And obviously people have got to earn their living and so on and so forth. So it's very hard to imagine. It's not unrelated to Josh Cohen's book, Not Working. I mean, I think these are probably all in the same sort of area of preoccupation, which is how much are people suffering from a tyranny of purpose or a tyranny of thinking they know what they want. And, you know, again, retrospectively, you can see when psychoanalysis writes about sexual perversion, it's actually writing about people thinking they know exactly what they want. In other words, a psychoanalytic theory of perversion is a story about consumer capitalism. It's about people being induced to believe that the thing to do is to be able to know what you want and then have the wherewithal to get it. What it can't allow for is, A, you might not know what you want, and so all wanting might be experimental, and B, life might not only be about wanting. There could be something else you could do.
In fact, because you talk about regimes of attention, and one of them is morality. Morality is nothing if not telling us what we should be attending to and what we shouldn't be attending to. The other one you talk about, of course, is Freudian sexuality, which is a regime of attention. It's all about that. Yeah. And then another one is creativity, which is a sort of attempt to get away with attention seeking without look as though it's something else. Yeah. But the really kind of extraordinary one, actually, you just referred to is the economic one. That our whole language for attention is economic. Yeah. So you pay attention. Yeah. And even the notion of interest.
And what you invest in.
And what you invest in. Yeah. And even vacancies of attention has a kind of commercial...
Yeah. If you think of it, if you think of the difference between taking a 3-year-old child for a walk and going for a walk with a 3-year-old child, you can take a 3-year-old child to the park, to the shops. If you go for a walk with a 3-year-old child, you'll sort of go round in circles. You might not get 30 yards from the house if you literally follow them where they go. Yeah. And that is young, relatively unmediated attention. And it's a very, very interesting experiment because, of course, if you're a cross, impatient adult, you'd think, you know, for fuck's sake, let's do something. But actually, the child is doing something, and you will see just how intent they are. But it's unformulatable. And it is, by our standards, profoundly non-purposive. We're not getting anywhere, we would say. And the child, of course, is getting where they want to go. It's very, very different.
You're very careful to make inattention a form of attention and attention a form of inattention. And to make attention and distraction not opposites, but meaningfully related to each other. But you do also say that attention nourishes us and distraction is a kind of, it famishes us. Is that a word?
Well, yes, or sometimes. Yeah. I mean, the risk would be for this to become a big idea, because sometimes attention can be radically depleting. And distraction can be amazingly enlivening, as we know. So I think it gets back to the big idea question. If there's a big idea, then the big idea is what we should be attending to. And then there's the problem of distraction. But the distraction could be the protest against the big idea. Or it could be the thing the big idea doesn't cover. So that I'm supposed to be reading this book, but I'm daydreaming about what I'm going to have for supper, or about my girlfriend, or my children, or whatever it is. And the question is, should I actually be reading the book? Who says? Well, lots of people say I should be, but then there might be a whole lot of other people who say no, daydream. I mean, Winnicott's got a very interesting distinction between fantasy and fantasizing. Fantasizing, he says, is like a bolt hole. So you go to this place in your mind, but there's no nourishment. Nothing happens. You go there to stop time. And then there's real fantasy, which is like the formulation of desire as a way of getting to reality in which there can be real exchange and nourishment. So the kind of distraction that I wouldn't promote would be the kind of distraction in which there's no nourishment. You don't feel more alive, you feel more depleted.
Last time I interviewed you here about, in writing your other book, I asked you what the interesting is. I don't know if you remember this. I asked you what the interesting is, and you said, it's whatever gives you an appetite for the future. It's really stayed with me. In this book, there's a Tristram Shandy section, and there's the notion of the hobby horse, which ostensibly is, you know, the thing you're most interested in. Yeah. But you describe a hobby horse as a refuge from the future.
Yeah.
You talk about.
Well, as an adolescent boy, your hobby horse can be masturbation. The most thrilling, blissful, exciting thing on earth. But over time, it may dawn on you, or you might find out, that actually there's one thing better, and that's a relationship with a real woman. And that's where there's exchange. So in the masturbation fantasy, it's thrilling, but fundamentally dead. There's no future in it, unless it becomes a way of experimental action and thought. In other words, it becomes a way of imagining the sex that you might then have. But it's all to do with how much fantasy gets you to reality and makes exchange possible that isn't enraged. So you don't then find a woman and get enraged with her because she won't be part of your masturbation fantasy. You meet a woman because she is somebody else, and that's the point. Whereas if you get stuck, in other words, if you are fixated and can only pay attention to your masturbation fantasy, you will have no experience, or you'll have murderous no experience.
Is it? Did you give me the sign? Oh.
Yeah, what was that sign? We don't know what the sign was.
I think I saw the sign. Okay. Okay.
Is there one last question you want to ask me?
Oh, shall I ask?
No, do you want to ask one last question? Is there one last thing you want to say?
I got too many last things. Oh, no.
Okay, later.
Later, yes. Questions from the floor. I think I'll take 3 questions and then at a time. I've got one here.
Just on
We just
Hold on
we've
one
got
sec.
Sorry,
thanks.
you at the back.
just the way you were talking about shame and you close down, you don't want to reveal. What is it that's so freeing when someone is open or vulnerable and able to talk about their shame? Because you said there's such a push there's such an effort to close down and not reveal, but then what happens when it is revealed?
Well, presumably the freedom is reactive to the previously felt constraint, that the shame has been a way of holding oneself together, circumscribing one's behavior. And this is not a suggestion that we should all do the shameful thing at all. It's just that we should be able to have a conversation about the shameful thing, and then we can decide. But clearly, if there's some release, enormous release. But then it seems to me this has got to be a story about consequences, because there's enormous release, and then what is there? And then what is there? In other words, how does the story continue? And of course, it'd be different for each individual person. But I think you need a long-term view and a short-term view.
You broke my 3 questions rule. But that was between you two. I think now we'll do 3 questions. Yeah.
3 more.
I'll ask a question. It might be tangential. I don't know if it's, but what kept occurring to me when you talk about attention is people can look at the same thing and see very different things. And what does that say about attention and the personal experience?
Well, it says a lot. It's the point in a way, isn't it? Which is that there are multiple aspects. So I can see something from lots of different points of view, and lots of other people can see them from points of view that I can't imagine. I mean, we can't see ourselves as other people see us. The point about attention is there are multiple aspects. And then the question becomes, which are the aspects that we want to include and why? And which are the aspects we want to discard? But it's all about that. Things look different from different points of view.
So, over here? Yeah. Lady. Should we go one at a time?
Yes.
We're going to go one at a time.
You've talked about what shaming does to us, and I was thinking if you could talk a little bit more about the act of shaming. What is behind it, and then what does the person who is doing the shaming get and don't get, or doesn't get?
Well, I assume this is a sadomasochistic contract, so to speak. In other words, that the wish to shame is the wish to expel and punish the part of oneself that one is ashamed of. That's one of the things that's going on. And also, and it's part of this, that there's presumably some exhilarating sadism in shaming other people. It's a bit like saying, it's you and not me. And there's presumably a kind of relief in that. So it's a kind of distance regulation. But I think the wish to shame is where this all starts. You know, if I force my 3-year-old child to go on my walk and I mock her for walking around in circles, she's going to know about what shame is. And she's then going to have to do two things. She's going to have to dissociate her wish to have her own walk and manage the rage that's been evoked in her by my treating her like this. So it's as though shaming somebody is like a form of humiliating revenge on them. And it's got to escalate. You know, if you shame people, then presumably it can only carry on.
So, just behind, yeah. Oh no, just lay behind, yeah, there we go.
I'm wondering about the connection between guilt and shame, if there is one.
No, there is one, and it's in the book. But broadly speaking, I mean, all the formulas obviously are neater than the experience. But in guilt, you let somebody else down, and in shame, you let yourself down. That's one way of putting it. So the guilt is to do with one's obedience to the external authorities. Shame appears to be to do with obedience to the internal gods, absolute gods. But one thing is much more apparently sociable than the other. One of the things I try and convey in the book is that actually shame has more to say about sociability than guilt does. Because I think guilt is about abiding by rules. Shame is about something much more profoundly enmeshed with other people. One more question?
Oh,
Is that your rule of three?
No, my rule wasn't just three questions in all.
Oh, I see.
My rule was we take three at a time.
3 at a time? Oh, I guess we could have 9.
I see, I thought you must have thought me terribly punitive. There's only three lucky chances.
Okay.
No, sorry.
3? Oh, Christ. I can only hold one in my mind.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. It seems to me that the two things that were guiding what you just told us about were psychoanalysis and then the act of reading or literary criticism. And it just struck me as you were talking that the principal meeting point between the artwork and the analysand is that they both, in some ways, magnify our demand for attention. They're saying, interpret me.
Yeah.
And I guess my question would be that, given that both the analyst and the reader don't say, this is this, they just say, I've noticed this. In what ways do both the reader and the analyst attend to something in similar or in different ways?
Well, the salient difference is that the analysand can answer back and the book can't. And that does make a lot of difference. But I think still it doesn't alter the fact that there is an exchange going on in fantasy. That I think when you're reading a book, I mean, I don't know if it's true of everybody, but when you're reading a book, you are having a conversation with the author or something akin to a conversation. I don't know whether it's with the author, but with something or somebody, with the language. So that I think that in a way, it's like conversation by other means. But it's similarly an exchange of words.
I just wondered if there was if criticism is always shaming, like if it has a sort of a useful function, like keeping someone safe or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because, of course, we're encouraged to believe that we should be good at taking criticism, that that's a really impressive thing to be able to do. It certainly isn't my experience. I mean, I'd much rather be praised. Occasionally, people say critical things that engage me, and I'm struck by them. But I often feel got at. Now, that's me. I'm not saying this is true of all of us here. But I do think that there's something that the risk is that criticism becomes the wish to shame. You know, that at one end, there's an ordinary attempt to modify or a genuine question. At the other end, there's a wish to humiliate. And it would seem to me much better if we stop humiliating people and start asking them questions, not questions we know the answer to.
There's a couple of questions at the back. I have no idea.
Not 3, 2.
So just one at a time is the new policy. Yeah.
New rule. I think it's rule.
Thanks.
Would you say that the need to apologise is connected to shame?
I think the need to apologise is a magical solution to shame. And I think it's a very bad thing. I think people shouldn't apologise and they shouldn't forgive. But that's just what I think.
Just as an aside.
Okay, one more question.
Oh, yeah.
What's the time? Oh, we
I
haven't
don't
got to
know.
watch.
We
Does anybody know
don't
what the time is? Do you know what the time is?
Oh, yeah.
One
More
more
question.
I was just thinking this Yi Yun Lee thing that I kept getting reminded of while you were saying that, like, she says she feels very ashamed of herself. She's very prone to shame.
I'm sorry, can you speak up? I can't.
Oh, sorry, yeah, hold it close. So this writer Yi Yun Lee, she says she's very ashamed of herself. She's very prone to shame, and she came to love novels like Jane Austen or whatever because it was like a fantasy of being in a world where she didn't exist, just to have loads of people talking, and she obviously had nothing to do with it. And I was wondering, like, you were saying about the idea of style as kind of a way to transform shame, but is that kind of attention outwards to novels, whatever, can that be transformative in a way that, say, like you were saying, that thinking about the self is the most damaging kind of thing, that kind of selfism that can result from shame? Or what else can there be that can be transformative?
I would have thought most people in this room have had the experience of reading being transformative. But the most interesting thing to me about it is that it's transformative often in indiscernible ways. I mean, that's say one doesn't really know the effect of a book one loves or hates on oneself. But what one does know is that something in one is compelled to go on attending to it. And that seems to me the thing to go for, to follow. That for whatever reason you want to go on reading this book. But it's not a cost-benefit analysis. It couldn't be. Because the book you're reading is part of the dream day. It's simply part of something that may or may not be made into something and will be digested in unpredictable ways. And you may never know, but you may know the experience of reading it felt very, very compelling. And yeah, go on. We can say.
Did you finish?
No, go on.
Because I think that was we do seem to be coming to this idea of reading, actually. And you do mention in the book that actually reading is one of the main ways in which we notice our inattention.
Yeah.
It's when you're reading, you suddenly think, I just read 3 pages, I didn't notice anything. And it could be because you weren't engaged by the book. It could be because a line 4 pages ago engaged you too much. And what you did whilst drifting off was carry on.
Or you were reading unconsciously. So in fact, you were very engaged, but you can't remember the last 3 pages. But something was going on.
And it reminded me of Proust's Days of Reading, his essays about reading, where he does say in that essay that actually he sort of prefers books to people because you can tell them what you think in a way that you can't with people. But the extraordinary story he tells about reading is that at the time he was doing it in his childhood, everyone thought Proust isn't interested in us. He's only interested in his books, and he was shutting out the world with his books. He says, but the legacy of that reading is that he forgot the books, but because he was reading, he remembers the people and the places. Yeah. As though the reading was causing him to pay attention to the other things. I'm coming back to this because I cannot emphasize enough how much this book has meant to me. I've read it a few times because my mind kept drifting. And sometimes it drifted beautifully and sometimes anxiously, and I'd look at my phone and sort of check out Brexit or something. But it did both, intense pleasure and intense anxiety. And you say at one point that the shame can be suffered and it can be punished, but it can't be read. And one of the things that happens in moments of shame is reading becomes impossible. I feel this book is unbelievably original. It's experiential. We don't know what attention is. There's no big idea, but we know it's not a commodity, and we know that an object is defined by the distractions to which it leads. And I think something here has happened in the history of attention and the history of psychoanalysis. A redescription has occurred, and style is doing new things. I really recommend you read this book a lot of times. And whether or not you figure out what it's doing for you, I hope it gives you even a modicum of what it's given for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.